Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Today is Easter, and I'm sure many of you were expecting some kind of an Easter episode where we talk about a particular Son of God that did not rise from the dead. And in a weird twist of fate, we are still going to be talking about another kind of sun that is also losing its shine, and that is the April 8th, 2024 Total Solar Eclipse. If your YouTube homepage looks at all like mine, and you are being bombarded with prophecies of the end times and what the April 8th Total Solar Eclipse means for you and your religion, how it signifies the end of the world or the wrath of God, or it serves as a great warning, then pay attention to this video. I have three simple goals for this video. One, I want to go through the science of these kinds of things. I think first and foremost, it is a failure of education on why we have such an insane response to these astronomical events as we perceive them to be supernatural events. They're not supernatural, they're natural. And so part one is going to be an explanation of the naturalness of these events. And part two is all around the history of these kinds of things. I want to take you through other times and other cultures and other religions as they dealt with eclipses. I want to show you how common it is to try to attach supernatural meaning and warning and doom and gloom to these kinds of events. And then three, and most importantly, I want to talk about why we do this. Why do we attach such meaning? Why do we not learn from the past? Why can we be completely wrong about all of this back in 2017 and seemingly learn nothing from it and make the same kinds of claims in 2024? Why do we do these associations? What is the psychology involved? What cognitive biases are happening here? And what hope is there for the future? So I hope that you will take a little Easter break with me today to learn about this event and the phenomena around this event through a scientific, historic, and psychological understanding. So let's start with the basic concept. What happens during a solar eclipse? And by the way, if you are a science geek and you already know this and probably better than I do, feel free to skip to point 2. An eclipse happens when the moon crosses in between the sun and the earth. It's that simple. This casts a shadow from the moon onto the earth, creating darkness temporarily. So the precise alignment of the sun, then the moon, then the earth is required in order for an eclipse to occur. And yes, there are different kinds of eclipses, and a total solar eclipse is the one that we as humans seem to find the most extraordinary, because essentially it looks like it's nighttime when it's daytime. And before we understood what was happening, I can only imagine how insane that would have seemed and how filled with purpose and meaning. But not only do we understand why these things happen, we understand when, how often, when they've happened in the past, even though we weren't there to observe it, and when it will happen in the future. But before we get to that, let's talk about the kinds of eclipses. You have the total solar eclipse. That's pretty obvious. This is when the moon completely covers the sun. Then you have a partial solar eclipse. That is when the moon only partially covers the sun. These happen often, but they don't get as much attention. And it's something to remember when we get into the bias of why people think it is so special how the moon and the sun line up in just the right way. And then you have annular eclipses. These are pretty cool looking too. It happens when the moon is too far away from the earth to completely cover the sun. And so you get that ring of fire look, if you will. So these are basics for the eclipse, but why it happens is a little more technical and I think really interesting. Now, the first thing to understand here would be orbital dynamics. And yes, this is still pretty simple, although it's not something that was always known, including by the writers of the Bible. But thanks to science, not faith, we understand how these things play out. You have the sun, and Earth orbits the sun, then you have Earth and the moon orbits Earth, but it's in an elliptical, meaning that the distance between these heavenly bodies, if you will, varies. That's a really important thing to understand as we get into some of the objections coming up here in a minute. Next, we should talk about the ecliptic plane. The Earth and the moon orbit in slightly different planes. Solar eclipses occur when the planes intersect at the points known as nodes. The eclipse can only happen if the new moon occurs near these nodes. And the third factor of why it happens is synchronization. The alignment of the sun, the moon, and the earth is a precise and delicate event. This is what makes it feel so special. And when things are special, humans like to attach meaning. If you didn't understand how all this works, the general basis is that the sun is 400 times bigger than the moon, but it's also 400 times further away, which allows them to look like the same size in our sky. I've heard very rational Christians who are very scientifically based say it's too perfect. That has to be designed. This to me is a fundamental misunderstanding of probability, the size of the universe, and even if there was a God who wanted these things to be able to happen, to what purpose? What has happened with all of the other eclipses that have ever happened? What does he utilize them for? Are they to build faith? Because it seems like they mainly build fear. There's so many unanswered questions here that it just ultimately seems to become useless. And when you see how often this happens, it becomes rather mundane. I mean, for instance, we've had 46 total solar eclipses, not even just partial or annular, 46 total in just the last 100 years. Essentially, that means every other year of you being alive, you get a total solar eclipse. So why does this feel so special? And I don't want to get too much into point 3 that we're going to be covering, but we're just so hypersensitive to our immediate environment. We have made where we live be the epicenter of not only the Earth, but then the Earth being the epicenter of the universe. And these things simply are not true. This is the first one to happen in 7 years in the US. So for people living in the US who happen to be Christian, with a very short memory of how nothing happened 7 years ago, we rile ourselves up and we have this event. There will be another one in the US in 20 years. And then in 21 years, there's going to be a huge one that essentially goes from California to Florida, covering the whole country. Mark my words, Christians will lose their mind. Oh my gosh, this is the second one in less than a year. What does this mean? And this one's covering the full US. It's going to be insane. And it too will pass without a rapture, without the end times, unless we've brought it upon ourselves. And fun fact, just to do the math, we have 53 more coming in the next 100 years. It's just math. So let's talk about that math really quick. How do we predict these things? There's 2 terms to know for this, and it's the different cycles that we have. We have the Saros cycle and the Exolemos, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. The Saros cycle is an 18-year, 11-day, and 8-hour period after which eclipses repeat. Fun fact, this cycle was first identified by the Chaldeans over 2 millennia ago. But this cycle is just the harmonic alignment of our cycle around the sun, the moon cycle around us, and the rotation of the Earth. That's it. It's just 3 things that have to happen, and they only happen together perfectly once every 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours. The Exolemos is essentially just a triple Saros. It's a 54-year event where you get the exact same happening. So essentially a nearly identical eclipse, except shifted about 120 degrees westward. Now, if you're wondering why, if a Saros event only happens every 18 years, why we have so many more eclipses within that 18-year time frame, it's because there's layered events or parallel events. While one Saros series is waiting for its next 18-year mark, another one is hitting its mark right now. There's a whole lot more we could talk about. We could talk about the difference between the solar and the lunar eclipses, the time shift, that 8 hours at the end of the 18 years, 11 days, 8 hours, that time shift that happens is what actually allows us to have the vantage point from different parts on Earth. We could talk about ecliptic conjunctions and all kinds of fascinating things that I don't pretend to be an expert on, but I have read a lot about it, and I got to do a little extra research for this video, which just makes my heart happy. I love talking about these things, and I'd encourage you to go and fill yourself in. If these events seem cool to you, or worse, seem specifically meaningful to the particular religion that you happen to have been brought up in, maybe, just maybe, you should go and understand the basic scientific facts of it first. The last thing I'll say from the scientific side before we move into the historic side is we, as Homo sapiens that have come to consciousness in the relatively recent past, all things considered throughout all of time, just so happen to wake up at this time when the moon is the right distance and the rotation of Earth is happening at the right speed and the sun is a far enough distance away. But this isn't how it has always been, and it's not how it always will be. So yes, through amazing algorithms and precise math from today's modern technology, we're able to track thousands of years back and thousands of years forward. Just talking about total solar eclipses alone, yet alone all these other astronomical events. But there will be a time as things are slowly moving further from each other where the alignments just don't make sense anymore, and we'll probably be long gone as a species by then. And so it just so happens that for this one planet and the life that evolved on this planet, we've been privy to these kinds of events. But they're not the only kinds of events that happen, and when you consider how many different events happen and how big the universe is, it starts to just become, again, not to take the awe out of it, a bit mundane. But enough of all of that. Let's leave science behind for a minute and let's go to history. Again, a really fun episode for me to talk about some of my favorite interests. How eclipses have been perceived throughout time and place again, in this small little fraction of Earth's history, is a fascinating understanding. And we know more than you might think from different cultural and religious perspectives, and I'd like to share some of those with you. Let's go back to the birth of where so much has come from, and that is ancient Mesopotamia. Here, the word is wrapped up quite simply. These people, when they witnessed these events, considered them to be omens. It seems like not a lot has changed, as that is essentially what the modern day believer still expects. But let's talk about the omens. We actually have some really cool information from the Enuma Anu Enlil, a Babylonian astrological series of tablets. And here we know that they considered these eclipses to be omens for war, for famine, and for the end of the world. And yet, here we are. I'm going to give you tons of examples, but I think it is this simple. Look at these people from thousands of years ago, where we have documented evidence that they considered these eclipses, which again are not all that rare, just maybe more rare to one group of people who can't travel the globe as freely as we do today and has no understanding of their mechanics, to witness this event that is definitely outside of their norm and say, it must mean this, it must mean this, it must mean this. Are we just incapable of putting ourselves in someone else's shoes and saying, you know what? They thought like we thought, except they were wrong. So maybe there's a chance we're wrong, right? I did the math on this. If we take a starting year of ancient Mesopotamia, which is kind of hard to do, and we place it at 3100 BCE, and we go to the present, there's been roughly 25,620 eclipses. That's both lunar and solar, kind of based off the average of 5 per year. Think about that for a second. Put yourself in ancient Mesopotamia. You're seeing yours for the first time. You have some elders that have said, this has happened before. Maybe they've even kind of mixed their memory together, and last time this happened, it seemed like we were at war with so-and-so, so this time it's going to happen, and there's been tension building over here. I bet it means we're about to go to war with this particular enemy. But 3 months later, so not quite arrived, you have a drought, and it leads to a famine for the next 2 years. In some kind of confirmation bias, the collected memory of these people is, well, we had a war one time. Then there was another one of these, and even though we said there would be a war, it actually happened to be a famine. Even though it didn't happen for 3 months and then it lasted for 2 years, we're still going to tie it to this one event. And so now when another one of these comes around, we're going to say it's going to be the end of everything. Now, I'm not saying that's exactly what happened, but that's the kind of things as we see them in the human psychology build up, and we see how bad we are at remembering things and placing things in their correct context, etc. How much more horrific is it to understand that since that time, we've had another 25,620 of these, and we have not yet learned this lesson. This is a failure of education, for one, and an obvious issue for human psychology. We are meaning-making machines, but we are not all that consistent, rational, or logical. Okay, but I won't go off like that on all of the historical examples, but let's go through some more. In ancient Egypt, it was all about the sun god and the battle. So you had the sun god Ra and the demon serpent Aphobis. And the demon serpent Aphobis was always trying to swallow the sun, the source of life. And so within this pantheon of gods and understanding who's in charge of what and having this one great demon serpent, which is pretty common for a lot of these areas at the time, including the ancient Canaanite pantheon from which Yahweh comes, we even see him fighting the chaos monster of the deep in his own holy texts. But I'm getting off track. Of course this makes sense to them. Of course this is how they interpreted it when the sun became dark. Oh, there's that great serpent trying to swallow our sun. But look, the sun emerges victorious. Go Ra. It's just amazing to me how obvious this is. And many Americans would say, oh, how silly to think that a serpent was trying to swallow the sun, while not understanding that they believe in a mythology where the same serpent exists, but also we have the serpent who brings temptation to the garden that convinces people that didn't know of good and evil to do evil, to be cursed with evil forever, needing blood sacrifice from a son of a god who is himself. Like, obviously, our story is not all that more coherent. And to think that there's still a great message in the sky happening during an eclipse, that it's somehow God organizing and rearranging the heavens, even if he's using the natural laws of physics that he created to tell us or to fulfill prophecy in front of our own eyes, things from his magical, glorious, mysterious, miraculous power. This is what I mean. We seem to be incapable of learning from our past. Even let's look at the Islamic traditions around eclipses. We actually have some interesting supposed quotes from Muhammad. I'm going to read it to you. The prophet is reported to have said during an eclipse, "The sun and the moon are two signs amongst the signs signs of Allah. They do not eclipse because of the death or life of someone. So when you see them, invoke Allah. So not so much omens, just signs. And signs of who? Their particular God belief. Humans are so very predictable. Let's jump forward a little bit. Let's go to medieval Europe. Now we get to start invoking the Bible. So the eclipses here, we're going to be signaling the death of a king, perhaps, or a famine or a war. And here we can see documented the interpretation of these things through a religious lens and people utilizing the Bible to seek understanding and explanation. One of my favorite interpretations of an eclipse comes from the indigenous tribes of North America. I'll use the Navajo as an example because I don't want to speak about all of them the same as if they all had the exact same ideologies and religious understandings, but the Navajo specifically saw eclipses as a time of transformation, of renewal, and of natural balance. So they would have ceremonies during the eclipses to help usher in or restore this kind of harmony and balance. They saw it as a rearranging of the fundamental elements of the universe. How cool. What a great, at least not inherently negative concept of what was happening at this time. Ancient Hinduism has a fun mythology for us, and it revolves around the demon Rahu. According to legend, Rahu was decapitated by Vishnu, and so his head has been ever flying through the sky, trying to chase and swallow the sun and the moon. Thus the eclipses. So therefore they are seen as these great spiritual events in which many Hindus would then perform rituals to keep themselves safe from harm. Going to ancient Greece, we have a fun story which we can take with a grain of salt, and many of you have probably heard of Thales' prediction. Thales, who was a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher, is credited with predicting accurately the eclipse of 585 BCE, which supposedly halted the battle between the Lydians and the Medes, or Lydians, as they interpreted the sudden darkness as a sign from the gods to make peace. I love this story. I don't know how true this story is, but just given, again, how common these events happened and how common warfare was in the ancient world, it's not a stretch to think that at some point, for someone on Earth, at some time, an eclipse happened to occur during a battle. And yes, of course, that would have seemed like a message or a sign. And it's important to look at that math to not be overwhelmed by emotion or meaning, and instead just understand that some people were going to have this happen. It is truly what coincidence means. People always say, oh, it's too weird or it's too unique to be a coincidence. No, that's the definition of coincidence. Let's talk about Norse mythology. With the Norse, you have two wolves, Skal and Hedi, or Hedi, who are constantly chasing the celestial bodies. And when an eclipse happens, it just means the wolf caught one. That's it. It's pretty fun. You just have these two eternal wolves always chasing down their prey, and every once in a while, they get lucky. And yes, at different times in Norse mythology, it has been associated with different meanings, but that's been kind of the general story for it. I don't know if you guys love all this as much as I do, so I'll not do too many more, but let's talk about ancient Japan, specifically through the lens of Shinto belief, which does understand there's natural phenomena, but imbues it with spiritual meaning. You get some interesting stories like that of Amaterasu, who was the sun goddess, and the imperial family believed they were descendants of this sun goddess. So they would perform rituals to pacify the gods and thus protect the nation during eclipses. For the Mayans, and you're going to start to see a pattern here, they had a jaguar god who was always chasing the sun. So the jaguar would swallow the sun, and this was a bad omen, which then prompted them to engage in an increase of already many rituals that they were doing. And some of these, of course, included sacrifice, all in an attempt to appease these divine forces. I want to focus on two more that show kind of the advancement towards our modern understanding, but also the holding on to superstition. And it really started with the medieval Islamic world. They made great scientific progress in understanding the natural side of this phenomenon. Now, they still associate it with signs from Allah, but at least they started to understand that these things were just part of a process or the mechanics of something larger playing out within an order of things. Building off that would be the Renaissance period of Europe, where we get a reigniting and a rediscovering of much scientific understanding. We have so much information about this period of time, whether it is via Kepler or Copernicus, who are explaining and detailing and being able to accurately predict eclipses. We're understanding things in more scientific terms. However, despite the emerging scientific knowledge, we just could not let go of the superstitious side of this and what it could mean from divine interpretation. And that has essentially been our MO ever since. Yes, we understand it. Yes, we know why it happens. Yes, we know how it happens. Yes, we can understand how many times it's happened in the past and even that it will continue to happen in the future. And yet, we can't shake off this flawed bias of, but it must mean something. But what does it mean? Is it a warning? What is God trying to tell us? Let's look through our holy scriptures and try to find more information. Let's see how we can link this up. Let's see what connections we can make. What patterns can we establish? And it is this horrific and also awe-inspiring mix of our natural human tendencies for meaning and pattern and connection right in the middle of this scientific understanding and this superstitious nonsense. And I just wonder how many more eclipses will have to come and go before we can finally say, you know what, we were wrong. And now it just is this. It's just something else that happens. I wonder if there will ever be a time where there is not people screaming from their rooftops, look, here it comes, the end is near. So now I'm already moving into point 3 here, which is why does this stuff keep happening? And I think it's a mix of religious superstition and human psychology. And we're explaining it from some different aspects here. But this first one, I believe, is narcissism. We are so inherently self-aware and aware of only our particular small circle of influence and where we live and what people who have lived where we have believed and our history and our God, etc., that we take everything in, all of this information out there in the ether, and we funnel it in and filter it in until it gets to ourselves. This then becomes truth, which many people can't just look around and say, oh man, this great funneling is happening to that culture over there, and it happened in the past over there, and oh, there's someone who's a Mormon and they're funneling it differently, and there's someone who's a Muslim and they're funneling it differently. But we block all that out, we don't see the patterns, we're too focused on ourselves, and we bring it all into this is what it means to me. Yeah, there was one in 2017, but I wasn't aware of it. And I live in America, and this is happening over my state. I live in Arkansas. Last time, Arkansas wasn't in the line of totality, but it is now. And so the people around me are talking about it more than they did before. If you read the biblical passages just right and you interpret the different meanings in the numbers, actually 2024 has a numerical significance. And so that one was a warning. And then this one is the one that means X. And it's just so sad to see the self-importance to dismiss everyone else's experience around you and in history to make yourself the center of the universe about why the event of a moon on its typical orbit passing in front of the sun, moving around us during our rotation and our orbit around the sun every once in a while in a predicted way will cause a shadow. That's all that's happening. There's a shadow on our earth for a couple minutes if you're in the right spot. And we have made so much of it. And to me, it is just so very telling of how little we have truly been able to evolve in time with our technological advances. Millions of years of evolution, hundreds of thousands of years of the human brain being in a certain state, and then bam, an industrial revolution, computers, internet, etc. We simply were not ready for this amount of information and ability to be connected worldwide and to know so much. We're still looking for the snake in the grass because that represents the real threat. It's going to take so much time for our limbic system, our lizard brains, essentially, to be able to catch up to our prefrontal cortex and to rationally and logically assess this information at large as a community. And the longer that superstitious religious beliefs linger, the harder that will be. When you layer on our God concepts and our religious histories and how we have made religion so much a part of the culture, that faith is this other way of knowing, then even though we have scientific fact and information, one's faith tells them there's still something else here. If there is order in the universe that is causing these eclipses, where did that order come from? And if that order came from a higher being with knowledge of the future, could that being not be utilizing those natural forces that he created to try to communicate something to us? After all, we have religious reason to believe that he does utilize the heavenly bodies for communication or meaning. God creating each and every star, of giving us two lights, even though one doesn't produce light, the sun and the moon. And so let me read to you and give you some examples of, in the Christian religion's own holy text, how there has been meaning imbued with these heavenly celestial bodies. In Joshua 10:12-13, we have a passage that describes the miraculous event of God holding the sun still in the sky to allow Joshua and the Israelites to be able to continue to fight a battle longer and win. And so yes, it's not an eclipse, but it is a God utilizing the sun itself for divine purposes to create an outcome that was beneficial and willed by him. In Joel 2:31, we get prophecies that mention the sun being turned to darkness and the moon to blood before what? The great and terrible day of the Lord. This verse is probably on 100 videos that are coming out right now. The sun being turned to darkness. When do we see that happen? Oh, a total solar eclipse. And it happens before what? The great and terrible day of the Lord. So despite the fact we've had, again, 25,620 since 3100 BCE, despite the fact that eclipses have been happening before those words were ever written down in Joel, and despite the fact that every single eclipse that has happened since those words has not meant the great and terrible day of the Lord, maybe this one. And here's some other supporting evidence, and out come the conspiracies. And there's plenty more biblical reference. In Matthew 2, you get the story of the Magi following the star that would lead them to the Savior. Unfortunately, in Matthew 24:29, we get Jesus himself mentioning that the sun will be darkened. He also says stars will fall from the sky, which is not how stars work, and the power of the heavens will be shaken. So this is an apocalyptic event that Jesus is referring to, and Christians will completely ignore the facts we know about the moon not giving off light or how stars cannot fall, and they will say, Jesus said the sun will darken. Eclipses happen, the sun gets dark. And make a mountain out of a molehill that's not even a real molehill to begin with. It's a nothing burger, and now it's the whole frickin' meal. It's just insane. And in Revelation 6, 8, and 12, we hear more about this darkened sun. So again, I could give you way more verses, but this isn't something that is from these crazy, ancient, incorrect cultures, mythologies, and religions of the past. This is something that in the book you turn to every morning for your quiet time describes these kinds of things. And as long as it does, and you attach truth and meaning to it, when these events happen in the world, it will be impossible for many believers to be able to disassociate what they're reading as truth, even though it's functionally wrong, and trying to make patterns, make connections to the real world. Now, this feels like a good time to say, I understand many Christians think the eclipse stuff is nonsense, that they don't look for meaning in the sky. They can obviously see that this is a natural thing that occurs and it's documented and it's scientific, and they can accept all of that. And yet, they still believe they were born with a dirty soul that requires spilt blood from the son of a deity to perform a particular kind of magic to allow them to live forever in the other realm with the being that is outside of space and time. So before you get on your high horse about how rational you are as a believer and how it's so silly that people are looking at the end times for this, please remember all the things you do accept from this Bible. And you accepting these things from the Bible, even if you dismiss others, continues to pave a way for others to believe all the other elements of nonsense and extrapolations of that nonsense that get us to the state of the world that we have. Religion equals superstition. Superstition equals a denial of logic and rationality. And the longer that this goes, the worse our chance of really improving as a species. That's what I believe. It doesn't mean that if everyone stopped believing in a God tomorrow, the world would be perfect. No. But we do get in our own way because of our religious beliefs and superstitions all of the time. So to wrap up this third and final point, and again, it goes for so many things, not just the eclipse. We're using this as kind of a launching off point to be able to talk about these kinds of issues. But here's a quick review of why I believe these associations continue to happen. One, we as people have a search for meaning. It seems we always have, and it seems like we always will. That's how we got religion in the first place. We needed understanding. We needed to fill in the gaps with gods of things we couldn't explain. And though we've closed many of those gaps, the ones that remain open, even in the slightest, we continue to say, must be God, instead of must be something we can't yet know or maybe never will get to. We don't like that. That's not emotionally appealing. Search for meaning. Alongside with that, number two, I would say, is the desire for control and predictability. We are so wildly outside of being able to control our environment for most of human history that anytime we could, we tried to. Oh, this seems to happen on a regular schedule. Look, okay, cool. Now we know. Now let's associate meaning to that, and bam, we have control. So these first two things work together, predictability and control, along with the quest and search for meaning. Three is simple: societal and cultural reinforcement. It's what everyone else around you believes. People with bias can point to particular things that have happened in the past, even though it's not really making sense in a larger picture. And bam, we're back to meaning and control. And four would be like historical precedents. We have this thing that has happened in the past. We have these prophecies that have come before, and we've seen them play out in other ways, right? People will read the Old Testament, they'll imbue Jesus into these prophecies, they'll look at the New Testament and see that Jesus fulfilled those prophecies, they'll look at other prophecies, including Jesus's prophecies about how the sun will be darkened in the end days, and here we are, what already feels like a crazy messed up world. The sun's about to get dark again over where I live, and I'm important, and so it must be. How ignorant, how unaware, how myopic. And then I've been just saying really carelessly human psychology over and over, but I want to give some specific terms that are going on here. The first is pareidolia. The easiest example of this is when we see a face on the moon or a bunny in a cloud. This is what I've been talking about the whole time. The search for pattern recognition and meaning in the mundane. So number one, pareidolia. The second one, and I've said it before in this episode, is confirmation bias. We so easily only remember our wins. We only remember the times where things did line up, or someone said something about a past eclipse. Again, I'm being hyper specific to the eclipse and then sometimes zooming way out. But when someone said, oh, the eclipse of whatever year, this also happened during that year. There was a great stock market crash. Like, look, guys, this stuff happens. And we build a case off of only the wins while ignoring all of the losses to see everywhere that we want to look what we're already expecting to find. Similar to the first one, pareidolia, would be number three, apophenia. And this is just kind of a backwards working of pareidolia. So the examples I've given about looking back at 2017 and connecting natural disasters with the solar eclipse and creating a connection there, creating meaning, essentially creating causal relationships that are not actually linked. And four, to be consistent with what we just went through, would be an availability heuristic. This is a cognitive bias that allows us to overestimate the importance or frequency of events that are more memorable or emotionally charged. And so yes, even though eclipses are common, to the individual who goes many years never seeing one and then sees one, that becomes a memorable event. It seems more unique than it is. We attach more meaning to it via some of the other things we've talked about, and we have overestimated its importance. These are just some examples of the psychology that lead us to continuing to do the same song and dance despite the fact that we are still here and all of these end time events have never happened. See this video by me if you haven't yet. If you're liking this video, you'll love that one. So that's it. That's really all I have to say. Have a wonderful April 8th. Enjoy the event. I'll definitely see you on April 9th, as the world will still be here in much the same fashion that it currently is. And until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank all of my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, Anne, Boris, GVI, Jacob, Joe, Martin, Oliver, Perry, Rokkit, and Shawn, my Humanist heroes, Jarrod and Kristi, my Atheist advocates, Caleb, Imposter, Jeff, Jeffrey, Karen, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all of my Secular Scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people.